Welcome to the camera settings tutorial for the Canon Rebel T3, T5, T6, T7 series cameras. And now for a review of the automatic settings. Full automatic with flash is a setting on the dial. It's indicated with the green colored logo, A with the plus. It's good for some things, but a lot of times the light can be pretty harsh. Automatic without flash is good for almost everything. The bad side is the light is only as good as the camera sensor or aperture size. That is, the camera plus the lens quality could cost you a lot of money. The more expensive the camera, the better the light sensor. Better the lens, the more light available to come into the camera. Let's look at program mode. Program mode is a mode on the dial indicated with the P, which the exposure is automatic, but you can manually control the settings like the ISO, the white balance, and color mode, so you only get to change the ISO. Take a look here at this sample. The ISO settings, if they are too high, you will see lots of granular imagery, artifacts, dust. As indicated in this chart below, you'll see that you can have low ISO. It'll be very sharp and crisp, where if you put up too much ISO, it could have grains in it. Now again, the camera quality will help determine how much ISO you really want to give. The more expensive, the bigger sensor on the camera, the less grains you would see if you were to brighten up the ISO. The ISO is much like brightening up the screen on your cell phone or brightening up the brightness on your monitor or TV. So ISO setting is not necessarily a good way to brighten up your images. There are other ways to brighten your images. The shutter priority, indicated with TV, is the shutter speed. That is, how fast the shutter opens and closes. The longer it's open, the more light that passes, so you get a brighter image. The drawback is because it's open for longer, anything that moves gets all blurred. Take these images for example. If you have action in the scene, they will be blurred. Often photographers will use this opportunity to be creative. Adding blur to your photos might be an artistic choice. Shutter is measured in seconds or fractions of seconds. In these samples here, you can see that they were probably used in 1/8 or 1/4 or 1/2 a second to make it look blurry. Here's an example where I increase the time the shutter is open from a fraction to a whole number, or in this case all the way to infinity or bulb, to do light painting. These light trails are very fun to do. You could be creative and you try some long exposure. And you can do this by increasing the time, that is, from a fraction to a whole number. So from half a second, you can go to 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then further on all the way to infinity or bulb setting. This long exposure setting is very helpful for creating these starry images at night. This particular photographer is going to be our guest next week. Aperture priority, indicated with the AV symbol. You pick the lens aperture. That's the lens opening, the size of the opening. Everything else is automatic. Your shutter speed will be automatic and your ISO will be automatic. The idea here is the wider the opening, the more light that passes. The more narrow the opening, the less light that passes. Your aperture number is indicated in f-stops, indicated with the F symbol, as you can see here. The number, as you see here, as it goes lower, the size of the opening gets bigger. These are indicated in units called stops. Depending on your lens, on the side of the lens you will see a number. That number will indicate how wide it can possibly go. Something with a very low f-stop can go very, very wide, let a lot of light in. Another thing happens with aperture. Because it goes wider, you have a more narrow depth of field. In order to create these stunning, blurry background shots, you need to have a wide aperture. I have this really cool 50mm lens that I use as indicated on the side. It's a 1.5, which means I can bring it down to a very low level and make these stunning blurry backgrounds. So when doing bokeh shots, you're going to want to use aperture priority to put priority on the lowest f-stop possible and all the other settings to be automatic. Full manual, you're on your own, kid. The indicated with the M symbol gives you power to change all three at any time. When in full manual, you will see a display on your screen with the fraction for shutter speed, the aperture number, the f-stop, and the ISO. If taken out of automatic, will include a number here. All camera screens are similar, not all the same, but you will naturally find all of these if you look for them. So you can change these settings by clicking this button here with your thumb and switching between the shutter speed and the f-stop. So just by holding this button down and turning the wheel, you can change the f-stop, indicated here, and then the shutter speed by letting go of the button and turning the wheel. So it's pretty much just holding the button down and changing the setting and returning to that setting. A 3.5 and a shutter speed of 1/2000 would look like this. That's way too dark. So shutter speed and a lower number like 200 and the f-stop being more narrow at 13 would be dark like that as well. So it's a happy dance between the two. You're going to go back and forth between shutter speed and f-stop for most of your picture taking. Here you're going to take a picture with an f-stop of 6.3, a shutter speed of 1/100. And then now change it up 1/25. That's 1/25 of a second. I'm going to darken it up a more quicker shutter, 1/200. Now I'm going to change the f-stop to its lowest for this lens, which is 3.5. Other lenses will go much lower than that. See how I can make it darker by increasing the shutter speed or lessening the shutter speed to make it brighter. So it's a slower opening. So the idea is to switch back and forth between them. Now what I neglected to do was change the ISO. The ISO, that number on the right. Now I'm going to be changing it and taking photos with the 400 ISO and messing around with my f-stop and my shutter speed to see what I can come up with. Much darker. So I'm having to put the shutter speed down really slow. Now this could present a problem. If you go too low, it gets all kind of washed out, smeary looking. This is a product of having a slow shutter speed. When it's way too slow, you can end up with a really bad blur, especially if you move the camera. I call it a smear. Here's a 1-second shot. And during that time, I may have shaken the camera a little bit, which would have made it look smeary. So mixing it up between these two is what you're going to do. Here is a chart to help clarify that for you. Notice that your f-stop aperture makes the images brighter if the f-stop is very low, which gives you the blurry background. This may not be what you're trying to achieve when doing a landscape, for example. That is, you're outside and you're trying to get an entire mountain scenery. So you would probably want to use a higher f-stop. Shutter speed, indicated here in fractions, you may want to be taking pictures of a race car and not want it to be blurry, in which case you would have a very high shutter speed. A lot less light, so you would need to either decrease your aperture or open it wider, or increase your ISO or brighten it up with the sensor. The drawback, you may end up with some artifacts. So it's a happy dance between these three. My advice to you is to really focus on these top two, aperture and shutter speed, and use the ISO as an adjuster.